This is a special announcement. We are heading to RSA conference in San Francisco for our 11th years of coverage, April 28, May 1st.
And as always, we're bringing you keynotes, conversations with organizers, speakers, industry leaders, plus the latest insights from the world of cybersecurity.
And we'll reconnect with old friends, meet new ones, and of course, we want you and your company to join us.
We have a few spots left for full sponsorship and our on-location briefings. You can book yours now at itspmagazine.com/RSAC.
We're going.
And you're coming with us.
Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new episode of Stories from Space podcast, where your host, Matthew Williams, examines the history of human spaceflight, the breakthroughs that revolutionized our understanding of the universe and our place in it, and the brave individuals who work tirelessly to advance the frontiers of our understanding. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
The authors acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the traditional unceded lands of the Lekwungen peoples. Hello, and welcome back to Stories from Space. I'm your host, Matt Williams. And joining me today is a very special guest, Keith Cowing, an astrobiologist, a former NASA employee, and the current editor and webmaster of NASAWatch. He's also the editor of spaceref.com, an online space news service, and astrobiology.com, an online resource about life in the universe. He's also an author, an educator, and an executive coach. Keith, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
So, let's get right into it here. NASA is experiencing what I would probably describe as a terrible shakeup right now, as a result of the new administration, as a result of the hiring and firing of government employees. As someone who has covered NASA events at NASA and has worked for them for several years, what exactly is your take on this?
This all started almost out of nowhere, moments after Mr. Trump was inaugurated as president, and the chaos ensued at warp speed. It's at the point now where he puts these things out every day called executive orders, which in essence tell everybody to do something, half of which are immediately challenged in court. But these things come out at such a rate that the government agencies here, just as they are understanding how they have to deal with one of them, two more arrive. So in NASA parlance, it's like drinking from fire hoses. And they have 5 or 6 at any given point that they're drinking from. And F equals MA, so every one of them is pushing somebody to the other side of the room, so it's chaos. But most of these have to do with what NASA does and who does it. And it's the same for all the government agencies. They have a goal of cutting back the workforce because they seem to think that if they cut 25% of the government workforce, they'll save vast amounts of money, but in reality, personnel cuts are 1 to 2% of the entire federal budget. They're not going to really change much of anything, but, it's all about appearances. So NASA, being a medium-sized organization, hasn't been hit hard yet. And I'll say that yet. If you were transcribing this, the yet would be in uppercase letters.
Well, yes. So in terms of what they have been hit with, there has been, I know for a fact that their DEI office has been forcibly closed. They've been ordered to drop statements regarding climate change from their
That's just started. That's the next. You'll ask me the question. So what's next, Keith? And I'll tell you that's next. But they're really going after DEIA, which is diversity, equal opportunity. It's in essence making the workforce representative of what our country really looks like in terms of, ethnicity, diversity, skills, age, gender, the whole thing. And that was almost instantaneous that they were ordered to remove all mention of those programs, all websites of those programs, anybody working on those programs. And then they went out to all the contractors and universities who get money saying, you have to, if we gave you money to do those things, you're not doing it anymore. And by the way, you have to remove all those rules from your website and we'll check back with you. And then they said, oh, by the way, we need to know if you forgot anything because we want to go get more of these people. And that was superseded by, oh, and by the way, now we're going to cut workforce. And it sort of went from an amateurish, just respond to this email that you'd like to leave the government. And then that didn't work. So they would put memos out, each of which would change things. And eventually it became the retirement, I hereby leave the agency thing. And the courts put that off several times. But in the midst of all that, they were scrubbing things that justified the programs that a lot of these people were working on so as to make their departure from the government easier to do. And so we're sort of at that point right now where that process is underway just to get rid of people.
Yes.
And what's
so,
next?
yes. What's next? Yes.
One of the things NASA does is study our planet. And most people aren't aware of this, I guess, because they vote weirdly. But we live on a planet. And one of the ways you understand what's happening on this planet is to study other planets. And you study other planets, and compare them to each other. And out of that becomes an emergent property of how planets and climate and all these things work together. Well, for some reason, Earth is special, not just because we're living on it, but because the current administration thinks that the theories behind how we're changing our climate, because we can do that, are bogus and bullshit and just not real. So that is now on the list of things to be purged. Now, NASA isn't the only government agency here in the States that studies climate. You have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is part of NOAA, part of the Commerce Department. Between NASA and NOAA, we launch and operate virtually all the satellites that the United States puts up that study climate and weather forecasting, El Nino, floods, the whole thing. Add in the National Science Foundation and the USGS, the United States Geological Survey. They also study the Earth. Now, together, these organizations over the years will all work together. You'll see people with grants to study climate change and so forth, and they'll get grants from NOAA, NASA, NSF, USGS, and a lot of other places. There will be a systematic series of executive orders that go to each of these organizations saying, you're not doing it anymore, remove all that stuff, come back to us and tell us how much you were spending, how many people there are, where they are, and we're going to remove that. And what's left, they'll probably leave some things because they want to have satellites up that are looking at weather, and it'll be consolidated somewhere. I don't think it'll be in two agencies. There's always been talk of making NOAA disappear or bring it into NASA. But there's also been talk of taking NASA's Earth Science and putting it in NOAA. But since they probably want to destroy NOAA, we're probably going to keep it here and shrink it. If you've lost your way in what I'm saying, you're not the only one who's confused about this.
So essentially, just another day under the Trump administration. Since inauguration, It's been unmitigated chaos. Well,
on a good day.
Yes, that is frightening to know. And in fact, I did hear there had been some talk about how NOAA was being targeted next, how they were to remove all mention of climate change from their research and literature. It's hard to know. I mean, yes, the news is coming at us so unbelievably fast. I also wanted to get your opinion, obviously. Now, the appointment of Jarrett Isaacman as NASA administrator, his position there. I heard some people who were clearly looking for a silver lining saying, well, this will be to the benefit of NASA itself. The guy believes in space exploration and so forth. And of course, Musk being appointed to an executive role, which does not exist officially and is not elected and so forth. What are your thoughts on those moves and how might those impact the space sector?
Well, right now, the way that they normally do this when a new administration comes in, they fill the big slots first, and that's the cabinet level agencies or departments. And so they've been focusing on that, and we've got Kennedy, and so forth. All these guys have made it through. These were the difficult ones, And if the difficult ones get through, the others that are not controversial almost will fly right through. And so the next tier is likely going to include NOAA, NASA, National Science Foundation, and these second tier organizations, which are often called cabinet level agencies. They're not part of the cabinet, but they're big and powerful, and their leaders are seen as peers, even though they're not technically in the president's cabinet. Now, there's a problem here in that we've got the first tranche through. Just as we're getting ready for the other guys, the Democrats have said that they're going to oppose every nominee in a way that makes each one like pulling teeth, putting them back in and pulling them out again. And as that is happening, even if you've got somebody who's, perfectly acceptable, they're going to have to get in line. Oh, and there's generals and there's other undersecretaries and so forth. Oh, and by the way, just as this is picking up, we're coming to the March 14th deadline here in America, where this whole budget thing is going to explode in a messy way and totally preoccupy Congress. So the real question is whether they're going to get any of these additional nominations through before that. So when it does happen, Mr. Isaacman, I'll tell you, I'm absolutely going to give the man the benefit of the doubt, just like you did Jim Bridenstine. And I have to say, I thought Jim was a wonderful administrator. I wish he'd come back, but he probably, burned a few too many candles at both ends in the years he was there. And God bless him for doing that. Isaacman, in many ways, is like him. He comes from the private sector. He's self-made. He's rich and all that. But, he's put his money where his mouth is, literally. He's bought rides into space. He's gone into space. And he's done it in a very, there's a long word, eleemosynary, in the public interest. And he raised a gargantuan amount of money for St. Jude's, did every outreach thing he could think of. And so, I sit back and I look at the guy. I've heard what he said. I got to say that he gets space exploration and it's his dream to be involved. And so I got to give him that significant number of points out of the gate. As to whether he's able to run the agency, well, he's a billionaire and he started companies, dropped out of high school, built companies. So, all right, he's figured that one out. But running a company as an entrepreneur, where you can make the rules and break them, is different than running a government agency. So that's the challenge. Normally, you fix that by having deputies and people in place who've done this before. And they've recently brought Janet Petro up from Kennedy Space Center to run the place in an acting fashion. The question is, will she become the deputy administrator? We don't know. That said, there's some big decisions that are going to come to NASA, one of which you were going to ask about, I'm sure, is the whole moon thing, the SLS, Orion, Gateway. And yeah, that's, I get asked about this a lot. Is it too expensive? Yeah. Is it behind schedule? Yes. Is it a good rocket? It worked the first time. I'm sure this hardware will all work, but is it the best way to go back to the moon? There's probably better ways. And you just go to Twitter and you can find 15 people telling you by 9 o'clock in the morning how they would do it if they could get their PowerPoint and cartoons turned into rockets. That said, you got to ask yourself, do I want to give the new administrator a horrible thing to do on his first day in the job and preside over the cancellation? Or are we going to cancel that first, create all the uproar and tumult, and then he comes in and he's the, let's fix all this sort of thing? That's my guess, is that you'll probably hear that bad news before he shows up. I would do it that way. That way you give him, a tabula rasa, a blank slate to pick up and run with. But right now, I don't know of anybody who's against it other than some of the Republicans who say, hey, you gave a couple $100,000 to Democrats. Well, so did Trump. So I don't know what the problem's going to be there. I think that'll be the bulk of the questions. But then there'll be, are you ready to lead these people? What are you going to do when half your, quarter of your workforce disappears? I mean, those are going to be the real questions he gets put to. And again, he's run a company. So I think he'll probably, if not have the answer, no, you know what, I got to get that answer, and I'll get back to you tomorrow morning with that.
Yes. So if you were to put money down on what the next few years holds, is that, yes, NASA is going to have its funding cut, its personnel cut, and they're going to expect Jared Isaacman to basically, with his entrepreneurial background, to cut through the red tape and make everything happen for cheap? Does that
happen? I don't know about cheap, but happen. And of course, I have to drop into why you're talking to me in 2025. When I started doing this in 1996, I started doing that when I quit NASA after the space station Freedom was reorganized and my entire office was blown up and all that. And I quit. And I started the website NASA Riff Watch when my friends at NASA were telling me that there was a reduction in force threatened. And I got a chart forwarded to me that said, it was just had a presentation where they talked about fear as a tool in corporate downsizing. Direct quote. Here we are 30 years later. The same thing is happening again, except it's fear on steroids. Whereas before it was people worried about their job. Now it's, we're not even going to give you time to cry about losing your job. We're just going to, they know the cost of things. They don't understand the value of things. And that is what they're really facing at NASA right now. So Isaacman's got to come into that and somehow talk to a bunch of people that, the ones who are fired are gone. You don't have to worry about them. They're gone. It's the people who stayed, who watched their friends get fired, who probably had to compete with them to keep a job, who have been traumatized for months. Like, do I have a job? Do I send my kids to college next fall? Do I whatever? And they're recovering from that. And, oh, by the way, we're going to change everything we were going to do and go to the moon. But, oh, wait, we're going to go to Mars too. And we're going to do it a different way totally that we haven't figured out yet. And you're sitting there having just been beat up by the tennis match of, whiplash. And you say, oh, okay, yeah, I'm here. And that's what we're looking forward to. And by the way, if you go look at the Doge charts, they just put one up today, and the average work age at NASA is in the 50s. So this isn't a bunch of, right stuff, Apollo 13, let's work the problem, people. It's a bunch of older folks who probably have a lot of skills, but haven't had to run marathons, so to speak, for quite some time. And they're going to fire people too. And the people who are going to get laid off are likely the ones last brought in, which are the younger people, the minorities, the women, and so forth. So that diversity and recent hires and new smarts may not be there. So sounds like a lot of problems. Out of chaos comes opportunity, I guess. And Mr. Isaacman, I wish him well.
So some good could come of this. That's what I'm choosing to take from that because
there is. It's not all bad. It's mostly bad, but it's not completely bad because there will be people left over after the earthquake, tsunami, impact event, whatever is going to happen with the agency. And by the way, it's happening everywhere else. So it's not like the NASA people will be moaning and groaning. It'll be everybody and my neighbors here in Washington, D.C. saying, you want to buy my house?
Yes, I understand. Also, this is basically the stuff of rumor and speculation, but I did, in fact, ask my boss at Universe Today if I had permission to go off and investigate this. So tell me if you've heard this one, I imagine a few times now, that Elon Musk is using his position as being right there in Trump's right hand to basically advocate for the exploration of Mars, to bypass going to the moon, or something to that effect. Now, I've seen no evidence of this beyond the fact that Trump had announced that, yes, Mars, we want to plant the flag there and ramble. And of course, Elon Musk was there beaming happily. So is there any, do you think there's any merit to this, that Artemis
You've described it well, and I have had that same sort of sniff and feeling that that's going on. I mean, you got to look at, again, what Trump said about Mars, how he said it, and the reaction of the people who want to go to Mars. I haven't heard the same enthusiasm about the moon, going back to the moon. I haven't heard him say no, but I haven't heard anything other than Mars. Elon wears the T-shirts in the Oval Office. It says Occupy Mars. So, yeah, I guess that's where he's interested in going. Jared Isaacman bought 2 flights from Elon Musk, and he's a Mars guy too. That doesn't mean that they're going to walk away from the moon program. It may be that they're going to do it differently, with a different thought as to, do we build lunar bases there, or do we just practice ops and so forth, and then just pivot quickly and go to Mars, or do we do both? Could you go to Mars cheaper? Yes. Anybody can do it cheaper than NASA. Safer? I don't know. More that those are the other things we'll see proved out. But when you have rockets that are so cheap that you build them like corn silos and you improve them literally in a real-time fashion as a consumer product, you're looking at a capability that may not exist today, but might exist in a year or two. Whereas with NASA, it's launch a rocket every 2 or 3 years and hope it all works right. And if it doesn't, you're hosed. Whereas with Musk, he goes, hey, here's my blooper reel. I mean, he's got a totally different take on it because he builds these like corn silos.
Yes.
So
Rapid.
that's the paradigm. It's not a paradigm shift. It's sort of like one of those hand whizzers that's just going to go, woo. This is a totally different take on things. And we don't really quite know how it will fit into what everybody's expecting to go to Mars. It may be they may have two Tiger teams competing inside of SpaceX, and the best way to do it, or competing with Blue Origin. They may throw a prize modality into this. I don't know. So, is the moon passe? All I could say is I'll be 70 in a few months. I grew up during Apollo. They said we're going to land on the moon by the end of the decade, and little 6-year-old me said, "Oh, hot damn!" Well, we did. And then they said Mars by 1981. I'll be in college. I'll be in my 80s when we do this. So Lucy and the football. But then I would hear, well, moon, we've been there. Forget about it for 20 years. Then we're going to go back to the moon. No, we're going to go to Mars. No, we're going to the moon, Mars. And it's almost like, are you moon or moon Mars? It's like this purity test. And so I don't know where the pivot is right now. When there's an absence of clarity in this, all things are possible and all things are not possible. And we're sitting in that, limbo right now. And until something falls out of the sky, it's the Twitterverse that's going to be figuring out what may or may not be going on with the pretty pictures that show up every night at 2 a.m.
That strikes me as a very, very sensible and sane characterization of a very insane situation. Yeah.
Exactly.
And
Thank
I
you.
feel,
Thank you.
yes, and I feel almost silly to ask you these questions and say, what is going on here, as if anyone knows, because it does seem like
it's interesting because I get interviewed a lot on. I kind of like doing international television because I like to talk to people not in the echo chamber here in the States. And a lot of times I have to talk to a translator. And I used to be a sign language interpreter, so I have the brain that can pause, and I have to sit and change. I've done that in real time. And when I get asked with an interpreter, I have to think, all right, you and I can talk in English. You speak Canadian, I speak English, and whatever. But when you try and explain this to people in the real world in simple language, it's hard to do. They would say, well, the moon, it's up there. We went there. Can't we just use those things to go back? And you have to explain that whole, well, that was then, this is now thing. But let me just toss something into the discussion here that I think we in the West, or at least in America, forget. I was on CNN one time, and they would brought up the whole China thing about landing on the moon. I go, you know what? Let them. We did it. And I'm certain that they will land, and we'll land next to it. Our big American gas guzzling lunar lander will roll down the window and say, "Howdy, where do you want me to park?" It's going to be okay. But if you look at the rest of the world, I remember when there was 1969, and they said it's the largest audience that ever watched anything on television, 1 billion or 2 billion people. Well, that was a big deal. Well, now that's like, that's a bad audience for something global. And when we do land humans on the moon again, more than 2/3 of the people living will have never seen humans walk on another world live. To them, it's been history, myth, conspiracy mongering, and so forth. And as I have often said, this will be doing the same thing again for the first time. This will be the first lunar landing for many billions of people in countries that we would never have thought back in the day would be capable of landing on the moon, like China. India is going to have its own space. I mean, you've got a dozen countries with the technological sophistication, and you've got people with more money in their back pocket than some countries for space agencies. So the whole paradigm has utterly changed. And you and I, we both got gray hair and so forth, are 1 foot in the old way of doing things. And there's a whole new way of things that's about to pop up. And I guarantee you, when we land people on the moon again and then on Mars, it will be in a way that we would not think possible, you and I here sitting right now, because things are just different. And I don't even know what I mean by that, other than things are different.
Yes. Earlier, when I mentioned the last 12 years, in fact, I was just thinking about connections or deja vu from the first Trump administration. Because as you, I'm sure, recall so much better than I do, but I remember when they took office, they had not met with NASA once at that point, and for a very long time they still hadn't met with NASA. And so NASA really didn't know what to do other than just carry on. They got a transitional funding bill. And then Mike Pence announces we're reactivating the National Space Council, and that we're prioritizing the moon. And he didn't say anything about Mars, but other than going back to the moon will be good for us going to Mars. Then he moved up the timetable, 2024, or heads are going to roll. And myself, I immediately began anticipating, oh my God, they're gonna have to scrap the lunar gateway and all that, because there's no way they can have that deployed in time, which ended up being the case. And then, of all things, Donald Trump undermined what they were doing by publicly stating, "Why are we going back to the moon? We should be going to Mars." He tweeted that, as I recall.
Yep.
Yes, and yes, at this point, I've sort of been scratching my head since, looking at NASA's preparations. So, putting aside the chaotic situation we're now in, it's like, okay, so NASA's current mission architecture for Artemis is that they're still got to launch Artemis 2, fly around the moon, come home. Then Artemis 3, it's going to consist of the Orion spacecraft with crew launching, SpaceX launching their Starship HLS, the human landing system, it refueling several times over in order to get enough fuel. Yeah. Then it's going to rendezvous with Orion. Then it's going to take 2 astronauts down, bring them back up, and basically drift in lunar orbit till whatever. Now, of course, everything about that seemed like, well, that seems very inefficient and wasteful, frankly. But yeah, that is still their current mission architecture. So I'm wondering, yeah, what is the likelihood that they're actually going to make their original deadline of 2028 with Artemis 3? Yes, at this point, is there even a hope that this will take place, that the SLS will be used, etc.?
Well, this is again back to the issue. I know that this discussion is happening. I don't know that they've made the decision yet, because it's trivial compared to all the other nonsense that we see going on, Ukraine and Treasury and judges and all this sort of stuff. But if they do decide to just continue Orion and SLS, I guess the question is, you're just going to fly the ones you have, which would be the next couple, or you can just not do it at all. I don't know what the answer is to that. I suspect that the next Orion flight, they're stacking the hardware now, so I got to think that's probably likely they'll do that. As for the other one, yeah, it's real complicated. It's complicated because Gateway's in the middle. If you were to cancel Gateway and say, we're just gonna maybe you can launch the crew into orbit on an SLS and maybe bring some food with you or whatever, but we're going to have a Starship in orbit that's going to go to the moon and come back, and you just fuel it more times, then it becomes simpler in that you don't have the Gateway and all that, all those halo orbits and all that stuff is gone. You're just going to go to the moon, do the thing, come back. For all we know, then he may land another Starship ahead of time with all the stuff so that the one that can land just has fuel to come and go. I don't know. It really comes down to, if you're going to cancel SLS, how do you cancel it? When do you cancel it? Will the funding there be cut, or will the funding shift over? When you cancel a program, you don't keep the money. Never happens in government. It goes away unless you reprogram or do something else. And of course, you've got to ask the question then, well, how do you get the bids in? Well, are you going to have SpaceX bid? There's a conflict of interest, maybe. We just had that thing where the Department of Defense down here supposedly had a $400 million bid for armored Cybertrucks, and suddenly they had to monkey with that procurement, and that's sort of in limbo. So are they going to have, Blue Origin bid? Well, Blue just fired 10% of their workforce. I don't know. It all comes down to how you do this, and if you put the facilities in place to ask for a new approach that goes through a procedure where you get hardware and mission ops and everything, and the money to do it, and the commitment to do it, and a timeline to do it by 2028, that would really, I don't know. I honestly don't know at this point. This is an equation with 77 variables in it, and it's really hard to collapse that into something. And unfortunately, because there's a lot of smart people that follow this, that's where you get the whole Twitterverse going off, and Elon just loves to jump in the middle of that. And it just swirls around. So everything seems real, even though it's not.
Thank you, Keith. This effectively ends part 1 of our look at recent changes at NASA and how they could affect the future of the space agency. Stay tuned for part 2, coming soon, where we'll get even deeper into the big questions such as, will NASA make it to the moon again before the Chinese send taikonauts there for the first time? All that and more coming soon. Thank you for listening. I'm Matt Williams, and this has been Stories from Space.
Sean.
Marco.
We are here to deliver a message from the RSA conference team.
It's an important message from our friends. RSA Conference 2025, just around the corner, where insights drive action, solutions emerge, and community connections spark innovation. You'll be there. I'll be there. We invite everybody else to be there April 28th through May 1st. You can secure your spot at rsaconference.com/ITSPMAG25. That's ITSPMAG25. See you all there.
I'll be there. See you there.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stories from Space podcast with Matthew Williams. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.